What I want to talk about this morning, if I may, is researching violent extremism and terrorism and some of the challenges that we face and also some of the directions it might be interesting for us to go as we proceed in this endeavor. As most of you, as all of you probably will know, extremism and terrorism on the one hand and the internet on the other hand are both very fast-changing realms. So they're tricky areas to research individually, and together, I guess things get even trickier. I wrote a paper back in 2015. It appeared in print in 2016, in which I tried to identify some of the ways in which we might seek to progress research on the intersections of terrorism and the internet, around so-called online radicalization, etc. I'm going to gallop through the points that I made in that article this morning, because there's a couple that I want to underline here, and then there's a couple that I want to add. So things that I hadn't really had cause to reflect on, I guess, when I first wrote this paper just a couple of years ago. So in that paper, what I said was that there are 6 things that I thought that we should think about, if you like. Number 1 was this issue of widening the range of types of violent online extremisms being studied, widening them in particular beyond jihadis, beyond the so-called Islamic State in particular. The second point was with regard to comparative research. I feel like we should continue to do comparison, and actually we should probably increase the amounts of comparative research that we're engaged in, not just across ideologies, but also across groups, across different countries and regions. So sometimes I think there's this feeling that because the internet is global, that it operates in the same or similar ways in different countries and in different locales. But I think what we've learned more recently is that that's not the case, in fact, or at least that's what internet studies researchers have learned. And I think that that's something that, that insight, if you like, is something that we need to draw on, those of us studying violent extremism and terrorism. Thirdly, I think we need to compare across languages, and fourthly, across social media platforms. The third point I made in that paper was with respect to deepening our analyses. So, in other words, to include things like interviewing and virtual ethnographic approaches and what have you. While number 4, at the same time, I think, upscaling. So, improving our capacity to undertake so-called big data collection and analysis. 5 was a request to outreach beyond terrorism studies, and in particular, number 1, to draw on what is a quite large now and increasing all the time literature that's been produced by internet studies researchers. So researchers who have nothing in particular to say about violent extremism and terrorism, but they have a lot of very insightful things to say about the workings of the internet and social media that we could take and think about and reflect upon in the context of this particular domain, so in a terrorism and extremism domain. And secondly, to increase our levels of interdisciplinarity. In particular, I would say to reach out to computer scientists, because they have many of the capacities that we lack in terms of collecting and analyzing very large amounts of data. That's difficult for many of us to do as computer scientists, but it's something that they have a particular interest in, obviously, and many of them are kind of agnostic as regards the domain. They're just interested in ways to collect and analyze data, and I think think that could be advantageous to us. And then sixthly, I said we should pay more attention to gender as a factor in violent online extremism, not just with respect to the role of women and the portrayal of women, though that's very important, but also ideas that appear in a variety of different ideologies that we see playing out online with respect to masculinities and in particular, I would say, hyper-masculinities, if you like. What I want to do this morning, though, is I want to, like I say, underline two things that I said in that paper, and they're both with respect to this issue of widening. I want to talk about widening beyond IS, so widening our range of violent online extremisms that we research beyond jihadis, beyond the Islamic State in particular, so that's one thing. And also to widen our focus beyond a single or a small number of social media platforms. Basically, to widen our platform choice beyond Twitter. I think would be a good place for us to start. And then I want to talk about two new things, like I say, that I hadn't thought about deeply enough at the time I was writing the paper. The first is with respect to visuals. And the study of visuals that are being produced by violent extremist and terrorist groups and their fans. And the second is with respect to ethics and the ethics of carrying out research in our particular domain. On widening, I did a very quick and dirty analysis of our Vox Paul online library, and that's what you see on the screen there. It presently has 514 entries, so that's pretty good. It contains, if you like, quite a large part of the literature in this area, and the focus is very much on terrorism, extremism, the internet, social media. It is a little bit weighted towards more recent publications, but it also has some of the older stuff appearing there too. And the thing about it is that in terms of that analysis, you know, what we begin to see is that the Islamic State is the bulk of the research in this area. Is focused on the Islamic State. And in fact, if you look in the third line down there where it says jihadi, jihadism, etc., in fact, the bulk of that literature is also about the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda come in a very tardy kind of 20 papers there after so-called IS, but in fact most of those papers are from the period post 9/11 and prior to 2013, 2014 and the emergence of so-called Islamic State as we know it today. So my point here is that we've really narrowed things down very, very considerably. And in many respects, I guess we know why. We're responding to the activity of Islamic State in terms of their, in particular, international terrorism footprint and their targeting of the West. However, I do think that this narrowing is very mistaken. It's mistaken to narrow to just IS and not keep our research eye, if you like, on violent jihadis and their online activity more generally. Bruce said earlier that, in fact, Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, so the Al-Qaeda community, if you like, is a more pernicious threat than that of IS. But we've dropped the ball, I think, with respect to that in terms of analyses of their social media and other online activity, and it's something that I think that we need to remedy. You'll also see that we've paid very little attention in recent times to other violent extremist and terrorist organizations. So there are just 56 papers in our online library that treats all of the extreme right. And a lot of that is really very general in its orientation. So it doesn't focus on any groups in particular, for example, but just discusses the extreme right in a very expansive kind of a way. I think a similar point needs to be made with respect to the platforms that we focus on. So not only have we narrowed our research too narrowly to the so-called Islamic State, but we've also really narrowed our focus. So we talk a lot about social media and terrorism, but quite a lot of the time, you can see from this slide, we mean Twitter and terrorism. But going back to my previous point, it's not even that if you think about it. Actually, we have a type. And our type is papers about Islamic State and their activity on a single platform, which is or was Twitter. And we really haven't paid sufficient attention at all, I think it's fair to say, to other social media platforms or to other online spaces. A particular one that I think is clearly difficult to research, but I think is as important as Twitter has been Facebook, certainly, but also YouTube. And then there are a host of other platforms that really haven't gotten any attention whatsoever. And you can see in our database, for example, so in our online library, there's a single paper about the use of blogs, there's a single paper about Reddit, a single paper about Telegram, a single about Tumblr, and a single paper about 4chan. And this, I think, points to the way in which there's the narrowing to IS, and there's also the narrowing of social media to a single or a very small number of platforms. So both of those, I think, need remedying. They are mistaken. And I think this is important, even if you believe that the most important issue right now is IS and their online activity. Well, A, we know that they have shifted because of Twitter's disruption activity to other platforms, in particular to Telegram. But also, going back to my earlier point about the importance of comparison, I think we can always usefully compare the activity of IS with other groups, with other ideological approaches. And I would encourage people to think about widening their focus as we go forward. Two new points, or two new areas that I think is worth commenting upon here then. There has been what's called a visual turn, or the visual turn, in politics and international relations scholarship more generally. And there are many more colleagues researching in this area at the present time, and they have been doing so for a number of years. And this is relatively unsurprising, I think, and is true also in the area of internet research. So internet researchers have also begun to focus much more on the so-called visual web. And again, that's relatively unsurprising because we know that the contemporary internet is very, very reliant on visuals. I think it's important to study visuals. Well, A, because we know that every major group that has a significant presence online right now, that's every major violent extremist and terrorist organization, has a visual profile, if you like, associated with them. IS, in particular, generate massive amounts of visuals, still images, infographics, but also large amounts of video data, etc. And they have been doing so for some time. And I guess it's worth going back to the old truism that a picture paints 1,000 words. All of these images are accessible to everybody in the sense that they're not language specific. So they have a very high audience uptake, if you like. They also have a very significant signaling function. If we think about logos, for example, if we think about the use of profile pictures and all kinds of other visuals that are playing an important role online at the present time. All that having been said, we as terrorism and extremism researchers really do have a marked tendency to rely on text and the analysis of text. And that's because doing visual analytics, it is difficult. However, going back to my point about the computer sciences and reaching out to computer scientists, a very hot topic right now in computer sciences is in particular visual analytics, still image analytics, and the analysis of digital video. And there's a significant interest on the part of computer scientists in various tools and technologies and ways to do this kind of analysis. And again, they're agnostic as regards the domain, so it is possible to reach out, I think, to them and begin to work on some of the data that we have available to us. I don't want to suggest that everybody needs to do big data research. It's perfectly possible also to do smaller scale analyses of visuals that are more narrow in their orientation. For me, the important issue is to pay more attention to the visual nature of the contemporary internet, to acknowledge that, and to do good work on that. I would say even sort of low-hanging fruit, if you like, hasn't been sufficiently exploited. So we don't know, for example, what were or are the most widely circulated images produced by so-called Islamic State. We don't know what their most circulated videos are, for example. Nobody has really done any analyses of profile pictures or so-called avatar images, which are really quite important visuals on the social web, for example. The fourth point that I wanted to make was with respect to ethics. I'm presently actually writing a paper on this particular issue, and as you might imagine, there are a very large number of issues that arise when it comes to researching violent extremism and terrorism and the net. But actually, these issues haven't been rehearsed in writing, certainly, in very many fora at all. So I think this is certainly something that we need to think about and to publish on and just to discuss actually amongst ourselves to a much greater extent than we have to date. I want to talk just about three issues quickly here in this respect. The first is with respect to negotiating so-called IRBs or ethics committees. I think this is, maybe negotiating is the wrong word in this instance, in fact, perhaps even educating IRBs and ethics committees about issues in this area. The problem with some of these committees, these university-level committees, is that they're familiar with neither terrorism or violent extremism on the one hand, or the internet on the other hand. I think it's fair to say that some of those committees can be hostile to both those things. So they have pretty significant concerns about terrorism research on the one hand and internet research on the other hand. And when you come with a proposal in hand and you say you want to amalgamate those two things, it can cause a kind of a meltdown, I think. So what we need to do is we need to prepare our IRB applications with this very firmly in mind, because IRBs are, I think, increasingly risk-averse. In particular, if your institution's IRB is staffed largely by hard scientists and generally also lawyers, especially those from, say, a health background, they can have very, very firm views about the conduct of human subjects research, that they will expect social scientists, internet researchers, terrorism researchers to comply with in a very, very uncritical way. So I think for us, we need to go into those situations with that knowledge at the forefront of our minds, but also seeking to educate people on those committees about research that's already been carried out in this area, that has been approved, where people have thought through various of the ethics issues and have had thoughtful responses to the issues that have been raised. It's very important for me to state at this stage, of course, that IRBs are absolutely crucial. Ethics committees are really important in university research settings and indeed more widely. Good ones obviously will raise important potential pitfalls. They'll work with you to resolve these before they become a problem for you. They'll take a critical look at your proposed research, and because sometimes we're, really engaged with this research and whatnot, and can't see the wood for the trees sometimes, if you like, raise issues that might not occur to some of us, and usefully so. So that's on the IRB issue. The second thing I want to say as regards ethics is that we're not journalists. It's not our purpose, if you like, to sort of get the scoop, to think only about the here and now. And I think there's a way in which, in some areas of terrorism research, particularly in this area of terrorism research, there is a way in which a lot of it is very focused on, what's about to happen tomorrow, or what's happening today if we're talking about some kind of an attack or crisis, and what's going to happen tomorrow, and always keeping our eyes open for the next attack, basically. But I think that's kind of mistaken. I think we need to continue to think like researchers. It can't just be about the here and now. There are important historical patterns with regard to terrorism, extremism, and the internet that oughtn't to be overlooked. Also, we should concern ourselves with trends over time and these kind of big-ticket issues, if you like. It's not for us to concern ourselves with each specific attack and the internet's role in that. That's a sort of a journalistic undertaking. It's certainly not for us to publicly out individuals and that kind of things. That's a pretty significant ethical issue. And we should bear in mind, too, that the laws that govern journalism are quite distinct from the type of regulations that govern research. And those are worth keeping in mind. Thirdly, in this respect, I think it's worth saying a few words about the impact of content on researchers. That the daily consumption of racist and other types of extremist and terrorism content can have quite negative impacts on individuals. So regular consumption, I would say, of very violent or very extreme content, such as, for example, beheading videos and similar types of things, can clearly have a very severe impact on individuals. A lot of media organizations, in fact, including some social media companies, have really begun to come to this recognition, to take this into account. But I think researchers are lagging pretty far behind in this respect. And I would caution that students, PhD students in particular, might feel like they need to display a high level of commitment, if you like, through a willingness to expose themselves to this sort of content. And I think we need to be careful about that and not dismiss this particular issue, as some people are wont to do. So just because you personally have no problem with consuming this content on a very regular basis doesn't mean that others will react similarly. And it's worth keeping that at the forefront of our minds. In terms of a conclusion then, well, I guess what I'd like to say is we need to think and talk more about some of the ethics issues that I've just raised, and indeed a whole host of others. Not just think and talk, though. We also need, I think, increasingly to publish so that others, can draw on the things that we learn as we go through these IRB processes and what have you, and we can build on good practice that is surely being developed in this area, but that we don't generally have access to because we've had a tendency not to publish on the topic. The second thing I'd like to request is that we embrace the so-called visual turn, as other colleagues have done in other domains, including ones very close to our own. So if terrorism studies is viewed as a sub-discipline of politics and IR, well then the visual turn is a significant one that has taken place in that domain already. And then the third is really not a request, it's a plea. Let's not shift our focus from IS Twitter to IS Telegram. In other words, let's not take our fixation on IS Twitter and shift it onto Telegram. Let's think more deeply about the wider social media ecology. So not just the wider IS social media ecology, but also the wider jihadi social media ecology. But it's not even just about social media, recall. It's probably more appropriate to say that we should widen things beyond the jihadis, but also beyond social media, because while social media is very dominant at the present time, it's actually quite reliant on a whole host of other online spaces and platforms and what have you. So Twitter, for example, has never been just about Twitter. It's 140 characters a tweet, right? So it's always been filled with links outwards to other domains, to other content, and what have you. And so I think we need to widen the focus, like I say, in order to incorporate knowledge about this wider online ecology. I'm going to leave it there. It's just for me to say I greatly look forward to the next couple of days, to thank Stuart, Amy Louise, and everybody in the cyber terrorism project here at Swansea University. It's been great to work with you over the last couple of years. I look forward to continuing to do so, and I look forward to hearing about everybody else's research findings over the course of the next couple of days and having the opportunity to talk with you about those also. Thanks.